Hey, thanks for stopping by. The Greater Will is one of the most mysterious aspects of Elden Ring. I'm going to make the case for why the Greater Will is actually incredibly weak. In fact, it's possible that the Greater Will isn't even alive anymore. After scouring the game files, I was surprised that the Greater Will is only mentioned in 5 unique item descriptions. Likewise, only 4 characters name drop the Greater Will. The only confirmed actions from the Greater Will are having the Elden Beast and the Fingers as its vassals, and sending the Nox underground long ago. With that in mind, let's look at the incantation Elden Stars. This is the most ancient of those that derive from the Erd Tree. It is said that long ago, the Greater Will sent a golden star bearing a beast into the lands between, which would later become the Elden Ring. So the Elden Stars and or the Elden Beast became the Elden Ring, and according to none other than Bandai Namco itself, the Elden Ring was the source of the Erd Tree. As a vassal, the Elden Beast is a separate entity from the Greater Will. Since the Elden Beast is the living embodiment of order, when we kill the Space Whale, we are both literally and figuratively killing the old order in order to usher in a new age, or chaos. But we also know that there were many civilizations and cultures that existed before the Erd Tree. There are the dragons, which ruled in the prehistoric era before the Erd Tree, and the Ainzel and Shifa rivers are said to be the grave of civilizations that flourished before the Erd Tree. As a further complication, must have been some type of time gap between the impact of the Elden Stars and the growth of the Erd Tree. We also know from various Crucible items that the Crucible became the Erd Tree. But what's the origin for the Crucible? One possibility comes from Hidetaka.
All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again.
You can see some obvious similarities between the Crucible and the One Great, where life is all blended together. But of course, Hidetaka is the complete opposite of an unbiased source. And even if her speech about the One Great and the Greater Will is true, she could also be referring to the Greater Will creating the entire universe, like a Big Bang, as opposed to just the Crucible in the lands between. The One Great is a fascinating topic. I did an entire video about it and its deep connections to Gnostic Christianity. So to me, it seems deliberately ambiguous if life existed in the lands between before the Elden Stars landed. This could be an attempt by the Golden Order to make the Greater Will seem even more impressive than it actually is. According to the Nox armor sets, long ago the Nox invoked the ire of the Greater Will and were banished deep underground. We're given very little information about what exactly happened between the Nox and the Greater Will. But since Nox Stella and Nokron are so well developed, I'm assuming that whatever went down must have happened fairly far back in the timeline. However, as both Mirko and Last Protagonist pointed out, the original Japanese is different. Instead of being banished, this could be translated as the Nox live defeated underground or destroyed they live underground. Banishment implies a conscious action and a form of punishment, but the Japanese text instead seems to imply that the Nox lost a war, or maybe some type of disaster on the surface forced them underground, or maybe both. I've got 2 ideas, and we are getting into unhinged speculation. My most elegant solution would be that the ire of the Greater Will is actually referring to the Elden Stars and its impact. It's not hard to see how a falling star containing the full might of what would become the Elden Ring would make the surface unlivable for the Nox and force them underground. I wonder if the ire of the Greater Will could be another way of saying an act of God to describe a massive catastrophe. My second idea directly involves Marika and her Newman past. We know very little about Marika's origins, but obviously there was a split between Marika and the Nox at some point. So I'm wondering if there was a civil war of sorts between the Newman and the Nox. Those who sided with Marika would win and go on to build Leyndell, while those who lost would be forced underground. Marika's ultimate victory and banishment of her one-time kin would, in a way, represent the ire of the Greater Will. In any case, I always found it fascinating that whatever happened to the Nox was one of the very few confirmed actions by the Greater Will. But since then, it's been pretty inactive. We can also learn quite a bit about the Greater Will from what it doesn't do. The simple fact that Marika could even shatter the Elden Ring shows that she has agency and isn't some brainwashed puppet. Now, you would think shattering the Elden Ring would be the ultimate betrayal of the Greater Will, and traitors usually get the death penalty, yet she's still alive. So why didn't the Greater Will just kill Marika? We do know that Marika can be killed. During the cutscene for the Age of Stars, when Ranni puts Marika's head back on, we see Marika's body dissolve into grace, and during the ending for the Flame of Frenzy, Marika's body completely crumbles. There's also the fact that the two fingers tell us,
"The Greater Will has long renounced the demigods. Tarnished, show no mercy. Have their heads. Take all they have left."
But the demigods are just fighting over the shards of the Elden Ring, which is way less severe than what Marika did. To me, the fact that Marika is still alive implies that the Greater Will didn't actually have the power to kill her. Otherwise, it would have made much more sense to just kill her and then replace her with another Empyrean. And there has been precedent for swapping in new gods. Placidusax is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Erd Tree, and we do see an earlier version of the Elden Ring in Malakath's arena. And even if the Greater Will wanted to torture Marika instead of killing her as a more fitting punishment, they still should have replaced her as Empyrean. Now, there could be another explanation for why Marika is still alive, but it makes the Greater Will look weak. In a previous video, I argued that Radagon removed the Rune of the Unborn, and this caused Miquella and Malenia to be born with afflictions. Ranni cast off her Empyrean flesh, Miquella is kidnapped and missing, and Malenia is dead without unalloyed gold. Now, Ranni does specify that those were the 3 demigod Empyreans, so there could be other Empyreans who aren't demigods. But even if there are other Empyreans, they don't seem willing or able to serve as the vessel of the Elden Ring. In other words, thanks to Radagon's sabotage, the Greater Will could literally have no other options than to keep Marika as Empyrean. So that would mean that the Greater Will is at the mercy of Radagon, instead of the other way around. This lack of power makes even more sense when you consider the very pitiful state of the two fingers. The ones in the Round Table Hold seem to be the last of its kind in the lands between, aside from Ranni's two fingers. In fact, when we first meet Roderika in the Round Table Hold, she tells us that this is the covert quarters of the two fingers. The Greater Will is supposed to be a powerful god, and yet its own vassals are forced into hiding. We can gain even more insight by looking at one of the most important dialogues about the Greater Will. When you defeat Morgott and see that Radagon has sealed off the Erd Tree, the fingers are stunned into silence.
The fingers dormant, severing our link to the Greater Will.
But if you talk to Gideon, he reveals that
the two fingers lost their purpose a long, long time ago.
This is further backed up by the spell Lord's Divine Fortification, which was taught by the two fingers to Gideon. Gideon gained true knowledge after his long exchange with the two fingers, discovering all had been broken long ago, that the trembling fingers, bent with age, and the Erd Tree itself were no exception. I believe what's broken about the two fingers is that they have not been able to communicate with the Greater Will, and they've been incommunicado long before we showed up. Now, I think this is the part of the fingers Gideon is referred to, since other aspects of the two fingers still seem to work. For instance, even after the fingers go silent, Enya can still use their strength to transform the remembrances into
mass weapons!
Likewise, even though the pairs of two fingers on top of the divine towers look petrified, we can still use them to fully unlock the power of a great rune. Aside from the idea that the Greater Will is just ghosting us, I see two possible explanations. One of them is offered by Enya, who tells us,
Shaken by this turn of events, they are busy consulting the Greater Will. When they are finished, the fingers will again offer their guidance. But thousands, if not tens of thousands, of moons must first pass.
So it could be as simple as a time delay across the vastness of space. The Greater Will either doesn't know about what's going on in the lands between, or it does know and we just haven't received their response yet. This could also explain why we really haven't heard much about the Greater Will's actions. The Greater Will really hasn't been that involved in the lands between for eons. We also have a subtle hint from the original Japanese, which uses this kanji to describe the fingers communicating with the greater will. And that kanji can also be used to specifically talk about telecommunications. Now, here's what really grabbed my attention. Aside from Enya, this kanji shows up only one other time, in the description for the Mogwen's sacred spear. In the Japanese, instrument of communion with an outer god could also be translated as a ritual tool of telecommunications. In other words, thanks to his sacred spear, Mo can instantly communicate with the formless mother and channel her power. So the fact that Mo can instantly communicate with an outer god could undermine the claim that it takes thousands of moons to get in touch with the greater will. This leads me to another explanation for why the fingers haven't heard from the greater will. The greater will is dead, and it has been dead for a while.
Nobody's listening. Nobody.
Now, if the greater will is dead, that would be quite the parallel to Nietzsche's famous quote that God is dead. He was trying to convey how the concept of God was no longer a central anchoring concept in a secularized West. The death of God is a massive ontological shock, and Nietzsche fully captures its disorienting array of emotions. Most famously, we have the madman, who is clearly pained when he proclaims that God is dead. Do we smell nothing of that divine decay? Yes, even God's decay. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How will we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? Who will wipe this blood away from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what holy games will we need to invent? Is not the greatness of the deed too great for us? Must we not become gods ourselves to seem worthy of it? The madman is also distraught by the mockery and disbelief of a group of non-believers who don't understand the enormity of what he is telling them. Nevertheless, in a later passage, Nietzsche explains that he and other philosophers and free spirits felt cheerfulness and serenity when they heard the news that the old god is dead. As if it beamed from a new dawn, our heart overflows with gratitude, astonishment, foreboding, anticipation. Finally, the horizon before us seemed free once again. Now, let's get back to Elden Ring, which can be read as a very literal reenactment of the death of God. Like the time delay for Starlight, it would also take ages for the death of the greater will to reach the lands between. When you fight the Elden Beast, the arena shows an endless horizon, with the sun either rising or setting. And if you mend the Elden Ring and become the consort of Queen Marika, you would presumably also become a demigod yourself, just like Godfrey. Finally, since the greater will is a made-up god in a video game, this lets Miyazaki and Martin explore the impact of the death of God in a way that doesn't rely on or offend someone's actual personal beliefs. In other words, the game lets anyone experience the emotional rollercoaster of learning that God is dead without having to undergo a real-life dark night of the soul yourself. I find this idea both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because this means that we're not ruled by the greater will or some type of outer god. We can forge our own destiny. On the other hand, I also find it terrifying that something as powerful as the greater will could die. How did it die? Was it killed by an outer god? This is fertile ground for theory crafting. I personally like to think that Ronnie is going into space to find out exactly what happened to the greater will, and maybe to make sure that it is actually dead and will stay dead. Thank you so much for watching. I know this take goes against the conventional wisdom, so I'd love to hear what Yens think. Did I persuade you, or is there something I'm missing? Please let me know down below.